You could argue that Kathleen Wynne's first job as Premier was to make people change the channel on how much they objected to Dalton McGuinty's canceling the Mississauga gas plant for craven political reasons and shutting down the legislature to boot. How's she doing at that? Well, here with some answers. Greg Lyle, he's the owner of the Innovative Research Group, one of the country's leading market research firms. Greg, good to have you back here at TVO today.
Thank you.
You have shared with us, which we will now share with our viewers, a lot of numbers on how things are going down at Queen's Park right now. And let's start with the obvious one, which is if an election were held today, what would people do? And let's, control room, bring that up first and foremost. Here's the vote. I can't ever recall, and maybe you can help me, Greg, when things were this close among the top three parties. Explain.
Well, not only are they this close right now, but they've been that close for over a year. What we've seen is over the past decade, both the Tories and the Liberals have lost ground. When we started doing our monthly tracking back in April of 2000, typically 70 to 75% of the public, if you just stop them on the street, 7 out of 10 would say, I'm supporting the Liberals or the Tories. Today, we rarely find more than half saying they support the Liberals or the Tories. Some of that has gone to the NDP, and that's why the NDP is now in the race. But some of it's on the sidelines, waiting to be mobilized to come back in.
If we can see that graphic again, one of the things two things to pick up on. Number one, the undecided's at 12%. Usually pollsters take that 12% and they sort of spread it evenly among the other guys. How come you haven't done that?
Well, I believe you need to be able to see what the race really is. So the issue isn't just who's supporting, what share of the vote the parties have, but how much more of the electorate is out there available to be rallied to a party. So 12% are undecided, but 14% say they wouldn't even vote or they don't care enough to say. And so when you put that together, the wouldn't vote, won't say, wouldn't, don't know who they support, none of the above, all those together is 26%, which is more than any one of the parties.
Right. So fair to say this is a completely open race. We have no idea who will win the next election based on those numbers.
Absolutely. There's no way of knowing at this stage. But one thing we can say is we've seen stories like this before. This is very reminiscent of what happened in Manitoba in 1988 when Sharon Carstairs came from nowhere to all of a sudden almost become the premier. And it's the same thing that happened with Gordon Wilson. What happens is people get tired of the two main parties and it stops being an issue of left versus right and it starts to become an issue of new versus old.
Gotcha. Gordon Wilson being the former Liberal leader in British Columbia.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's also remind people, we'd love to hear your feedback on this. So our online editor, Daniel Kitts, is hosting a live Twitter chat as we speak. So chime in and let us know if you think the Ontario legislature is working well or is it time for an election? And use the hashtag AgendaTVO. And we'll see whether or not your comments reflect what we've just seen here. Okay, Greg, let's bring up the second chart now. And you call this one value clusters.
Right.
And this indicates, again, with I think a lot more depth than normal, how the voter out there sort of breaks down. And do you want to take us through this, starting with, say, the top right-hand corner, where almost a third of the people identify themselves as, solid blue conservatives and then go from there?
Right. Well, what we do is that we ask people where they stand on issues, and then we use a process called clustering to group people that share common points of view. So if you look at the Conservatives, those are people that say the government spending should be according to its ability to pay, not according to the needs of the public. Every other cluster says spending should be based according to need, not ability to pay. So you can see with the deficit coming up that there's a polarization there that leaves the Conservatives with their hard budget message with about a third of the public on their side, but 2/3 against them on that. If we then bring in how do people feel about businesses.
Let's bring it up again, guys, so we can see this again.
Sure.
Where all right, so that 32% who are solidly conservative, Tim Hudak's got them on.
He's got them. He has over 60% of those voters.
But I see that there are sort of three different colors that the Liberals can play with here. How does
well, they
that
can
work?
actually play with four with Kathleen Wynne, which makes it interesting.
Okay.
And in fact, if you're not with the Tories and the Conservatives, then you're with Wynne, right? You're with the Liberals. So they are the second choice there. And if the Tories stumble and the Liberals don't alienate that group, they can pick up some second choice. If you look at the business Liberals, the next cluster over, those are people that think that business is the way to go. They believe that profit encourages hard work, that it doesn't create negative consequences. But there's only two groups that like business. That's the business Liberals and the Conservatives. The other three groups don't like them very much or actually dislike business. And especially the more to the left you go, the better it is. So if you think about the campaign positions of the Tories and the NDP, on something like how do we treat business, the Tories have nothing to lose by saying we should encourage business. The NDP have nothing to lose by saying we should make business pay its share. The Liberals are torn. They're in a difficult position because half of their potential coalition thinks that business is pretty good, but the other half thinks it's not so much.
Confusing.
And then you go on to that to look at redistributing wealth. Is the job of government to create a level playing field and let everyone run their own race, or is the job of government to make sure that we all end up about the same place at the end of the race? Well, the moderate levelers, the whole idea of levelers, is that they think government's job is to make sure we all end up around the same place, and the core left believes similarly. So you put all that together and you see, relatively speaking, how easy it is from a policy perspective to run a campaign from the left or right, and how hard it is to run a campaign from the center.
Right. Okay. We mentioned off the top that Kathleen Wynne's biggest job as the new leader is to make people forget what they didn't like about the old leader.
Exactly.
And let's see, admittedly only 3 months into her premiership, how she's doing. Here is the Dalton McGuinty pie chart. You see on the second deck down, Dalton McGuinty, December 2012, this is where people were. And you can see if you add up the two numbers on the left, the 33 and the 22, 55% of the electorate had a strongly or somewhat unfavorable impression of Dalton McGuinty. And only, where are we now, 33% had a very or somewhat favorable impression of him. Now let's flip that chart over to a month later, and here's January 2013 and Kathleen Wynne, and tell us what's the change here?
Well, the huge story in this numbers is that only 12% of the public actually dislikes Kathleen Wynne at this point in time. So the Liberal leader from 55, right? So they've dropped 40 points of negatives. Now, if we look at the party itself, it may have been that Dalton McGuinty had actually created negatives for the party brand, but when we dig into that, we find only 30% say they're so mad at the Liberals they would never vote for them again. So, and we also ask people how much change do they think there needs to be in terms of policy. Do they say that the government's generally in the right direction and only needs minor changes, or do they think it major change, or is it going fundamentally on the wrong track? And we find almost half of the public says they're either doing just fine or that they only need minor changes. And what's particularly striking there is that New Democrats believe that almost as much as Liberals do.
Huh. So when Tim Hudak, as he does almost every day, has a news conference saying the public is champing at the bit to get rid of these guys, the disgust for the Liberals is neck deep, that's not true.
No, but it is true among his voters.
Okay, well, that's an interesting distinction.
Right,
okay.
so his core voters are very mad at the Liberals.
But there's only a third of them.
There's only a third of them. But a big part of how elections work is not just what the overall preferences of the public are, but who's going to care enough to do something about it. Passion equals action. So if you're spitting mad, you're going to show up to vote. But if you're like, yeah, you know, come see, come saw, they're okay, but I'm not all that excited about them, then you might stay home. And so what he's trying to do is mobilize his base, so he has disproportionate numbers showing up because only half of us vote.
So not every voter is equal because not every voter is necessarily going to show up.
Well, from the position of who counts on election day, only the people that show up count.
That's true. I guess in the final analysis on that graphic, the Liberals have to kind of give Dalton McGuinty a real good housekeeping seal of approval because whatever negatives he had, he kind of took them with him when he went out the door. Isn't that right?
Partially true.
Partially, okay.
So it is true that he has taken them out the door with him and that they didn't immediately stick to Kathleen Wynne. But the other big number in the Kathleen Wynne numbers are the number of people that either actually don't know her yet or don't know what they think of her. And that's a majority of voters. Majority of voters don't know what way they're going to fall on Kathleen Wynne yet. And so if she spends her days defending the mistakes of the McGuinty Liberals, she's relatively quickly going to start wearing all the sins of the McGuinty Liberals. If she starts doing things that are different, then she has the opportunity to earn some favorables instead of just pick up those negatives that are out there somewhere.
Well, you did do some polling on what people think about some aspects of Kathleen Wynne, and let's share those with our viewers right now, because you did ask people about the following. You put it out there that it's exciting to have a woman as premier. And what did people think about that? 36% strongly agreed, 35% somewhat agreed, 15% seemed to have no opinion, only 11% somewhat or strongly disagreed. What do you take from that?
Well, it's the if you put it together, I mean, you're talking 70% that are excited about a woman as premier. And there's very few positive emotions that you can connect to in politics. Passion, excitement is one of those things. But excitement has to be tied to some action, right? She needs to be seen to be doing things, particularly doing things that those left liberals and those levelers would want to see a government do, which is do something to help them get ahead.
Do your numbers give any indication, and we don't want to spend a lot of time on this program, right, but we have an historic premier. She's not only the first woman, she's the first openly gay premier.
Right.
You got any numbers on what people think about that?
Yeah, we did look at that. And what we found is that, number one, there just aren't that many social conservatives left in Ontario. And that most people, a majority of people, say that it's a good thing that Ontario has its first openly gay premier with just barely double digits, about 14% saying that they don't like it. So that works pretty well for her. And even among the liberals, and there are liberals historically, if you think about sort of devout Muslims or devout Catholics who have a point of principle where they don't agree with same-sex marriage and those sort of issues, that when we dug into it, and it's a relatively small sample, but when we actually went into the 30 or so that are those types of people within our data set, we only found 3 of them that actually dislike Kathleen Wynne. So it looks to us like that issue, which was never going to be a big thing anyhow, is not even a small thing.
Are you sure they're telling you the truth?
Well, we don't ask them, what do you think of the gay premier? What we do is we say, what do you think about same-sex marriage? And what do you think of Kathleen Wynne? And we put those 2 things together, and we then say, well, people that are socially conservative, here's what they actually say about Kathleen Wynne. And then we also ask them, and what do you think about the gay premier? So we have the 2 different points to look at, what they reveal of themselves and what they say of themselves. And in this case, it's the same thing.
Gotcha. I find this final graphic that we're going to bring up fascinating because it just seems to spit in the face of conventional wisdom ever since the Great Recession kicked in 2008, which is, of course, it's always about jobs and the economy. But you asked people, what's the single most important change you hope the new premier makes? And look what comes in at number 1. Fix that labor dispute in the education sector. It's number 1 by a long way, ahead of creating jobs, ahead of health care, ahead of reducing the deficit, ahead of strengthening the economy, ahead of even, making our test scores better and fixing education. Were you surprised at that?
Yes, but if you think about it for a little bit, it makes some sense. Because a lot of these issues are things where the public looks that for decades they've been wanting things to be done about health. But government after government has taken it on and they don't see any real difference. So this is something that Daryl Broker spoke about in his new book, and Nick Nanos, actually Daryl quotes Nick Nanos on this. I think we've all found the same thing, which is that there's a lot of issues that you would think people would be concerned about, but they've actually sort of given up hope the government can do anything about it. The dispute with teachers is actually seen as being caused by the government. So if government caused it, government can fix it.
And she appears to have, admittedly early days, but she certainly appears to have lowered the temperature on this significantly. And now You've got both the elementary and secondary teachers' unions recommending that the teachers provide extracurriculars again.
Right.
So how much can she take this to the bank?
Well, the problem with politics is that once you fix the problem's gone. So the good news is that people will have an impression that she took on a problem they were concerned about and that she had some success, although it's not over the goal line yet. Assuming she gets it over the goal line, so there'll be a feeling, okay, well, at least she's done one thing better. But then the question is, so now what? And that's the bigger challenge, because she's got the deficit coming, she's got all the structural change that Drummond recommended, but no one's actually done yet. If she doesn't do those things, then the deficit's not going away. We've got, and, government is complicated. It's one of those things where, you fight so hard to become the leader, and all of a sudden you're the premier and you go, why did I fight so hard to get this job?
Well, we've got the 4 election co-chairs for the whenever the next election takes place coming on right after you. And for our last question here, I want you to give them some advice. Because here's the state of play as we approach the provincial budget. The Liberals obviously will vote in favor of it. The Conservatives will obviously vote against it. So once again, it will come down to the small NDP caucus to decide whether or not this parliament lives or whether we're going to the election. As you consider all of these numbers, plus others that you have in there, how does all of that play into the NDP's calculation?
Well, for the NDP, the problem they have is that they're fighting above their weight right now. So there's only about 16% of the electorate that identifies with New Democrats. That means that if you just stop them on the street and say, what party do you feel closest to? They say New Democrats. But they're almost equal with the two other parties that have much bigger bases. So their challenge is either to change the way people identify or change the nature of the fight. So what they really want to do is make it a new versus old fight instead of a left versus right fight. They actually had an opportunity. There was a point in the last debate where the two main leaders, Hudak and McGuinty, were sort of bickering at each other, and Horvath was right in the middle, and she had an opportunity then to do what Carstairs and Wilson had done in their debates, but didn't. Now, her challenge this time is that Wynne is not like McGuinty, and is she going to get into that sort of situation in a debate where she's seen to be bickering with Hudak? I'm not sure. It's not her style. So it's a harder thing, given the Wynne style, for them to make the new versus different position. I would argue, if I was New Democrats, given where they are, that I would let time work for me. I think it's very, very hard to deliver new and different in reality, and I would let the Premier hang herself, basically, by dealing with these sort of status quo issues and tough challenges that don't lend themselves to easy answers, and as the negatives pile up, then present myself as new and different.
So you'd find a way to support the budget if you were the NDP?
I would.
Okay. And we remind everybody, you were part of Mike Harris's Common Sense Revolution.
Yes.
This is advice coming not from a New Democrat or a Liberal, but from a card-carrying conservative.
Well, former card-carrying.
Former card-carrying. Okay, good enough. Greg, it's good of you to join us at TVO. Thanks
so
for your help with these very fascinating numbers.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.